He returned to his high-security penthouse after a brutal gang war, seeking the cold silence of his fortress to heal his wounds. Instead, he found a terrified Maid and her infant daughter hiding in his master's suite. As a mafia boss, he was a predator who lived by a code of zero tolerance. But one sound from the innocent baby stopped his hand, a soft, curious coo that pierced through his murderous rage. So Jin-woo was a man who ruled Seoul's underworld with iron and blood, a robot in a tailored suit who believed that feelings were a fatal flaw. Returning to his unbreakable sanctuary to wash away the stains of a recent battle, he expected isolation and absolute control. Instead, he walked into a world he didn't recognize, the scent of baby powder over expensive cologne, a makeshift cradle on his designer rug, and a woman who looked at him not with respect, but with the raw terror of the hunted. What began as a lethal security breach would slowly become a confrontation with the hollow life he had built for himself, and a choice to protect the very people his world was designed to destroy. The silence of the penthouse was usually absolute, a clinical vacuum that So Jin-woo paid a premium to maintain. But tonight, that silence was fractured by the rhythmic, wet sound of a baby's pacifier and the shallow, jagged breathing of a woman who looked like she was waiting for the fall of a guillotine. So Jin-woo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the skyline of Seoul shimmering behind him like a sea of cold diamonds. He didn't look at her yet. He focused instead on the reflection in the glass, his own rigid silhouette, the sharp line of his black suit, and the woman huddled on his Italian leather sofa, clutching a bundle of cloth as if it were the only solid thing left in a crumbling world. "You worked for the Park Syndicate," Jin-woo said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to make the air in the room heavier. Aruna flinched, her fingers tightening around Mila. "I was just a maid, sir. I cleaned the floors. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything." "In my world, there is no such thing as just a maid," Jin-woo replied, finally turning to face her. He didn't move toward her. He didn't have to. His presence alone occupied the space between them like a physical weight. "You are a witness who walked out of a dead man's house. My men found 3 of Park's soldiers in the alleyway yesterday. They were looking for you." Aruna's eyes wetted with fresh terror, her dark skin pale under the recessed lighting. She sank lower into the cushions, trying to shield Mila with her own body. "They'll kill her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They don't care that she's just a baby. Please, I don't care what you do to me, but let her live." Jin-woo looked at the infant. Mila was awake now, her large, dark eyes fixed on the shimmering gold watch on Jin-woo's wrist. She wasn't crying. She reached out a small, chubby hand, grasping at the empty air toward him. For a fleeting second, something in Jin-woo's chest, something he had spent 20 years burying under layers of ice and iron, gave a dull, painful throb. He walked to his mahogany desk and set his briefcase down with a deliberate click. The sound made Aruna gasp. He reached inside, not for a weapon, but for a heavy silver timer he used to track his morning meditations. He twisted the dial and set it on the table. 7 days, Jin-woo stated, the words final and cold. Aruna looked up, confused. 7 days? 7 days of grace, he repeated. The syndicate expects a report on the survivors of the park raid by next week. Until then, you do not exist. You do not leave this penthouse. You do not go near the windows. You do not make a sound that can be heard past that front door. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. I am not a good man, Aruna. I am a man who maintains order. If you break my silence, if you compromise the security of this house, the grace ends. Do you understand?" Aruna nodded frantically, her tears finally spilling over. "Yes, yes, sir. Silence, I promise." "There is a guest suite at the end of the hall," Jinwoo continued, his tone clinical. "It has its own kitchen and supplies. You will stay there. If the child cries, you muffle it. If I hear her through the walls, the clock stops." He watched her scramble to her feet, moving with the frantic grace of a cornered animal. She gathered her few belongings, a small bag of diapers and a tattered blanket, and hurried toward the hallway. But as she reached the threshold, she stopped and turned, her expression a mix of profound fear and baffling gratitude. "Thank you," she breathed. Jinwoo didn't acknowledge the thanks. He had already turned back to the window, watching the city. He listened to the soft retreat of her footsteps and the click of the guest room door. For the first time in his life, his fortress felt occupied. The air felt different, thicker, warmer, contaminated by the presence of life. He looked at the silver timer on his desk. The seconds were ticking away, a steady, rhythmic reminder that he had just invited a death sentence into his home. He was a man of logic, a man of cold calculations, and yet he couldn't explain why he hadn't simply handed her over to his lieutenants. As the hum of the city groaned in the distance, a very faint sound drifted through the vents from the back of the apartment, the low, melodic hum of a mother singing a lullaby in a language he didn't understand. Jinwoo closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the window. The 7 days had begun, and for the first time in 20 years, the boss of the So Syndicate felt the icy grip of fear, not for his life, but for the strange, fragile thing he had just decided to protect. The digital clock on the wall glowed a toxic neon green, marking 3 o'clock in the morning. For 3 days, the penthouse had been a tomb of silent, tiptoed movements, but the peace was shattered by a sound that Jinwoo's security system wasn't programmed to handle. It wasn't the tripwire of an alarm or the shatter of glass. It was the thin, rhythmic wail of a child in pain. Jinwoo sat bolt upright in bed, his hand instinctively sliding under his pillow for the suppressed semi-automatic that lived there. He stayed frozen for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs before the reality of his guests flooded back. The crying didn't stop. It grew sharper, more frantic, vibrating through the vents of the reinforced concrete walls. He threw on a silk robe and stepped into the hallway. The door to the guest suite was ajar. Inside, the scene was of controlled chaos. Aruna was pacing the floor, rocking a red-faced, sweating Mila. The room smelled of lavender and desperation. Aruna's hair was wild, her eyes bloodshot as she looked at him, her expression shifting instantly from motherly focus to sheer terror. "I'm trying," she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper as she bounced the baby. "I'm trying to keep her quiet. She's burning up, sir. I've used cold towels. I've tried to give her water, but she won't stop." Jinwoo stepped into the room, his presence cold and analytical. He reached out, his large, calloused hand looking monstrous against the infant's small frame as he touched Mila's forehead. The heat was alarming, a dry, radiating fever that made the child's skin feel like parchment. "She needs a doctor," Aruna sobbed. "Please, I have to take her to a clinic." "The moment you step into a hospital, your biometric data is logged. The Syndicate has eyes in every emergency room in Seoul. You'll be dead before the nurse takes her temperature." "Then let her die with me," Aruna cried out, her voice rising in a way that defied his rules of silence. "I won't just watch her seize in this beautiful cage." Jinwoo looked at the timer in the hallway. 4 days of grace remained. He looked back at the baby, whose cries had turned into weak, wet whimpers. He was a man who dealt in death. He knew the signs of a body failing. He turned on his heel and walked back to his desk, picking up a burner phone that was reserved for emergencies involving the upper echelons of the underworld.
He dialed a number that few in Korea possessed. "I need a pediatric specialist, and I need a grade A pharmacy delivery," Jinwoo commanded when the line picked up. "No, not the clinic, my private residence. If a word of this leaves your mouth, I will personally ensure your medical license is the least of your losses." Within 20 minutes, the intercom hummed. Jinwoo didn't let the courier up. He went down to the basement garage himself, meeting a trembling man in a nondescript delivery uniform. Instead of the usual briefcase of laundered cash or a shipment of unmarked hardware, Jinwoo accepted a small insulated cooler filled with high-grade antibiotics, cooling patches, and infant fever reducers. Returning to the suite, he found Uruna collapsed on the floor by the bed, still clutching Mila. Jinwoo didn't say a word. He opened the cooler, cracked a cooling patch, and handed it to her. He then measured a precise dose of the liquid medicine, his steady hands, the same hands that had tightened around the throats of rivals, now moving with a surgical, terrifying gentleness. He watched as Uruna managed to get the medicine down the baby's throat. For the next hour, Jinwoo didn't leave. He stood by the door, a silent sentinel in a silk robe, watching as the frantic energy in the room began to dissipate. The medicine took hold. The jagged wailing softened into heavy, labored breathing, and finally into the silence of sleep. Uruna looked up from the bed, her face wet with tears, her body finally sagging against the mattress. "Why?" she asked softly. "You could have just told me to leave. It would have been easier for you if we were gone." Jinwoo looked at the small, sleeping face of the girl who had almost cost him his anonymity. He thought of the courier, the phone call, and the trail of breadcrumbs he had just left for his enemies. He had risked a multi-million-dollar empire for a child who didn't even know his name. "I don't like things breaking in my house," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. But as he walked back to his own room, he didn't look at the neon green clock. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. The cold, logical robot of the Seo Syndicate was malfunctioning, and as he closed his door, he realized that the silence of his penthouse no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a countdown. The fourth day of the grace period arrived with a heavy, oppressive rain that turned the Seoul skyline into a blurred watercolor of gray and charcoal. Inside the penthouse, the air was thick with the scent of chamomile tea and the rhythmic, soft thumping of the dryer. Mila was finally resting, her fever broken, leaving a fragile peace in its wake. Jinwoo sat in his minimalist dining area, his eyes fixed on a silk scarf draped over the back of a chair. It was a high-end designer piece, but it was torn at the edges and stained with something dark and old. It was the only luxury Uruna had carried with her, a remnant of a life spent in the shadows of men like him. "That scarf," Jinwoo said, his voice cutting through the quiet as Uruna entered the room to retrieve it. "It's from the Park Estate, limited edition, a gift for the inner circle."
Uruna stopped, her hand hovering over the fabric. She didn't look away this time. The fear was still there, but it was being slowly eroded by a weary sort of honesty. "It wasn't a gift for me," she said, her voice steady. "It was a gift for the mistress of the house. I found it in the trash the night the sirens started. I used it to wrap Mila so she wouldn't inhale the smoke." She sat down across from him, the distance between the Mafia boss and the fugitive Maid feeling smaller than it had 72 hours ago. She began to speak, her words flowing like a dam that had finally burst. She told him of her life in the rival clan's compound, not as a soldier, but as the invisible woman who polished the silver and heard the secrets whispered behind heavy oak doors. "They didn't think I was human enough to understand," she whispered, her fingers tracing the frayed edges of the silk. "They talked about the shipments, the docks, and the ghost account, while I scrubbed the baseboards at their feet. They thought a black woman who spoke broken Korean was just part of the furniture." Jinwoo leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. The ghost account was a legend in the underworld, a digital ledger rumored to contain the bribe records of every high-ranking official in the city. It was the one weapon that could dismantle a syndicate from the inside out. The night they came for the parks, Aruna continued, it wasn't just about territory. The young heir, the one they call the Viper, was looking for a ledger. He killed everyone in the study, but he didn't find it. He didn't know that Mrs. Park had hidden the drive in Mila's diaper bag while I was trying to smuggle the baby out through the servants' entrance. The silence that followed was deafening. Jin-Woo felt the tectonic plates of his world shift. He had assumed Aruna was a liability, a witness to be managed or eliminated. Now he realized she was the epicenter of a storm that could drown the entire Sao syndicate. If his men found out he was sitting on the key to total dominion, the grace he had offered her would be viewed as the ultimate betrayal of the clan. "Why tell me this now?" Jin-Woo asked, his jaw tight. "You could have used that drive as a bargaining chip with anyone. You could have sold it and lived like a queen in another country." Aruna looked him directly in the eyes, her expression raw. "I don't want to be a queen, Mr. Sao. I want to be a mother. And I saw how you looked at Mila when she was sick. You didn't look at her like a witness or a ledger. You looked at her like you remembered what it was like to be human." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, unassuming silver USB drive, placing it on the table between them. It looked pathetic and small against the vast wealth of the Penthouse. "This is the war, and this is the only thing keeping my daughter and me from ever being free. Take it, use it, just give us a head start before you burn the world down with it."
Jin-Woo stared at the drive. For 20 years, he had climbed the ladder of the So syndicate by making the most logical, most ruthless decisions. The logical choice now was to take the drive, hand Aruna to the cleaners, and become the undisputed king of Seoul. But as he looked from the silver drive to the broken silk in Aruna's hands, he realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't want the power. He wanted the silence to be real. He reached out, his hand hovering over the drive, as the rain outside turned into a violent downpour, signaling that the time for grace was rapidly running out. The storm that had battered the penthouse windows for 2 days finally subsided, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum. Inside, for the first time since the 7 days of grace began, the air didn't taste of ozone and adrenaline. Instead, it smelled of ginger, toasted sesame oil, and simmering beef, a scent so nostalgic it made Jin-Woo's chest ache with a phantom limb of a memory. In the kitchen, Aruna was moving with a fluid, practiced grace that had nothing to do with her maid's uniform and everything to do with survival. She had found the emergency stash of high-end grains and frozen proteins Jin-Woo kept for his private chef, but she had transformed them into something Jin-Woo hadn't seen in 20 years, a home-cooked meal. "It's jollof rice," she said softly as he entered the dining area. She noticed his questioning glance at the vibrant orange-red grains. "I found the spices in the back of your pantry. It's a dish from my home. And I made a side of bulgogi for you, a bridge between our worlds, perhaps." Jin-Woo sat at the head of the heavy obsidian table. Usually, he ate here alone, scrolling through encrypted casualty reports or stock fluctuations. Tonight, the table was set for 3. Mila sat in a makeshift high chair, a reinforced laundry basket padded with Jin-Woo's cashmere throws, happily gnawing on a piece of softened carrot. "You didn't have to do this," Jin-Woo said, though he didn't pull away when she placed a steaming plate in front of him. "We have 3 days left," Aruna replied, sitting across from him.
In my culture, we do not leave a house without sharing bread. It is how we say thank you for the life we still have. As Jin-woo took his first bite, the heat of the spices hit the back of his throat, followed by the savory richness of the beef. It was a sensory explosion that felt dangerously intimate. He looked up and saw Aruna watching him, not with the terror of a victim, but with the quiet observation of a woman who had seen the man behind the monster. For a moment, the heavy silence of the penthouse was replaced by the small domestic sounds of a family. The clink of silverware, the soft babbling of the baby, the way Aruna reached over to wipe a stray grain of rice from Mila's chin with a thumb. Jin-woo found himself talking. He didn't talk about the syndicate or the ghost account on the silver drive currently locked in his safe. He talked about his grandmother's small kitchen in Busan, the smell of the sea, and the way he had once dreamed of being a carpenter before the streets claimed him. He spoke of the family he thought he had found in the Mafia, a brotherhood of blood, that he now realized was just a business of shadows.
My father used to say that a house is just stone, Uruna said, her voice a low melody in the quiet room. But a home is where you can sleep without one eye open. I haven't had a home since the day I arrived in Seoul, until this week. Jin-woo paused, his chopsticks suspended in the air. I am a mafia boss, Uruna. My walls are lined with lead, and my doors are triggered by biometrics. This is a fortress, not a home. A fortress protects you from the outside, she countered gently, leaning forward. A home protects you from the inside. Look at your hands, Mr. Seo. They aren't on your gun. They are holding a fork. Jin-woo looked down. She was right. His shoulders, usually pulled tight like a drawn bowstring, had slumped. The rigid, middle-aged man in the tailored suit was gone, replaced by someone who looked remarkably like a father at a Sunday dinner. The moment was shattered when Mila suddenly let out a high-pitched, delighted shriek, splashing her water cup. Uruna laughed, a bright, genuine sound that echoed off the cold glass walls. Jin-woo didn't laugh, but a small, involuntary muscle in the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It was the closest thing to a smile he had experienced in a decade. As the meal ended, Jin-woo felt a strange, terrifying weight in his stomach. It wasn't the food, it was the realization that the grace he had extended to them had become a trap for him. He had allowed the warmth into his fortress, and he knew that once the 7 days were up, the cold would feel more freezing than ever before. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, the boss persona sliding back into place like a mask. "Go to sleep, Uruna," he said, his voice regaining its gravelly edge. "Tomorrow the world will remember who I am, and the syndicate will start asking questions that a home-cooked meal won't answer." He walked away toward his office, but as he passed the laundry basket, he stopped. Mila was looking up at him, her eyes wide and trusting. He reached out and for a split second let the baby's tiny hand curl around his index finger. Her grip was surprisingly strong. He pulled away and vanished into the shadows of the hallway, the taste of the jollof rice still lingering on his tongue like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The 5th day began not with the warmth of the kitchen, but with the cold, rhythmic vibration of Jin-woo's encrypted burner phone. The screen displayed a single character in Hanja: loyalty. It was a summons he couldn't ignore. His second-in-command, a man named Kang with eyes like flint and a soul made of wet concrete, was already in the lobby. The transition was instantaneous. Jin-woo's shoulders squared, his face hardened into a mask of stone, and the father who had shared jollof rice the night before was buried under the weight of the boss. "They're here," Jin-woo said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp as he entered the guest suite.
Uruna was already awake, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She stood by the window, the morning light catching the terror in her eyes. Who?
My family, Jinwoo replied, the word tasting like ash. Kang doesn't visit for tea. He's here because the silence of this penthouse has started to scream. You have 3 minutes. He led her not to the door, but to the back of his walk-in closet. He pressed a sequence of hidden buttons beneath a row of perfectly tailored suits, and a section of the wall slid back with a hushed hiss, revealing a high-security vault. It was a space designed for gold bars and emergency munitions, barely 6 feet wide, cooled by a silent ventilation system. Inside, he commanded. Uruna looked at the dark metallic box and then at Mila, who was blinking sleepily in her arms. It's a cage. It's a sanctuary, Jinwoo corrected, his gaze intense. No matter what you hear through the walls, shouting, glass breaking, even if you hear my voice change, you do not make a sound. If Mila cries, you hold her until she turns blue if you have to. If they find you here, I cannot save you. He watched her step into the darkness. Just before the door sealed, he handed her a small portable oxygen tank and a silenced radio. The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving Jinwoo alone in a room that suddenly felt like a tomb. Minutes later, the elevator chimed. Kang stepped out, followed by 2 cleaners, men whose only job was to make people disappear. They didn't offer greetings. They walked through the penthouse with the practiced arrogance of men who owned the city, their eyes scanning the minimalist decor for a single hair, a stray toy, or the scent of a child. "Boss," Kang said, bowing slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on Jinwoo's face. "The syndicate is concerned. You've missed 2 board meetings. The Viper is claiming you've lost your nerve after the park raid." Jinwoo sat in his designer armchair, legs crossed, the picture of absolute control. "The Viper is a dog who barks because he's too small to bite. I'm recovering. My heart isn't what it used to be." "Is that why the grocery deliveries have tripled, Kang?" asked Kang, his voice casual as he stepped toward the kitchen. He ran a gloved finger along the countertop, stopping near a small overlooked smudge of orange jollof rice. "You've developed a taste for foreign spices, Jinwoo, or are you feeding a ghost?" The tension in the room spiked. Jinwoo didn't blink. "I hired a new chef, a private contractor. If I wanted to be questioned on my diet, I'd move back into the barracks, Kang." Kang laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He began to pace, moving toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Jinwoo's hand dropped to his side, fingers hovering inches from the hidden holster beneath his jacket. Every step Kang took toward the vault felt like a hammer blow to Jinwoo's ribs. "The Viper thinks you're hiding the Maid," Kang said, stopping right in front of the closet door. "He thinks you're holding out on the ghost account. He's offering a bounty that would make a king weep."
"And what do you think, Kang?" Jinwoo asked, his voice dropping to a register that signaled a death sentence. Kang looked at the door, then back at Jinwoo. He stayed silent for a long, agonizing minute, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he stepped away. "I think you're too smart to trade an empire for a maid, but the syndicate needs proof of life, boss, or proof of death." "You'll have your proof by the 7th day, Jinwoo stated. "Now get out of my house. Your breath is polluting my air." When the elevator finally hissed shut and the security light turned green, Jinwoo didn't move for 5 minutes. He waited until the sweat on his brow felt cold. He walked to the closet, opened the vault, and found Uruna collapsed on the floor.
She was shaking so violently that Mila had begun to whimper, but Uruna had kept her hand clamped firmly yet gently over the baby's mouth. Jinwoo reached down and lifted them both out. He didn't speak until they were back in the light of the bedroom. "The clock just sped up," he whispered, looking at the door Kang had nearly opened. "They don't suspect, they know. The grace is over, Uruna. We are no longer waiting for the 7th day. We are waiting for the first mistake." He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The suit was still perfect, the tie still straight, but the man inside was starting to bleed. He realized then that he couldn't keep them in the penthouse anymore. The fortress had become a funeral parlor, and the only way out was to go through the very men he had spent his life leading. The sun set behind the jagged skyline of Seoul, casting long, bloody streaks of crimson across the mahogany floor of the penthouse. The confrontation with Kang had left a lingering chill in the air that no amount of central heating could dispel. Jinwoo sat in his darkened office, the silver USB drive, the ghost account, resting on the desk before him like a live grenade. For decades, his life had been defined by the acquisition of such leverage. This small piece of plastic represented the absolute pinnacle of his career. With it, he could dismantle his enemies and cement his legacy as the most powerful man in the underworld. Yet his hand didn't reach for it. Instead, he found himself staring at the door. He stood and walked toward the guest suite, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He stopped just outside the cracked door, intending to tell Uruna that the extraction plan was being finalized, that the danger was reaching a breaking point. But the words died in his throat. Uruna was sitting on the edge of the bed, silhouetted by the soft glow of a nightlight. She was rocking a sleeping Mila, her voice barely a whisper, drifting through the room in a low, rhythmic melody. It wasn't the Joloffe song from the night before. It was something softer, a quiet confession hummed into the crown of a child's head.
"When we leave this place," Uruna whispered, her voice thick with a tired sort of hope, "you won't ever have to hide in a dark box again, Mila. You'll have a garden with real grass, not glass walls. You'll go to a school where no one knows the names of the men who hunted us. You'll grow up to be a doctor, or a teacher, or a painter, and you'll never ever have to know the weight of a secret." Jinwoo leaned his head against the doorframe, closing his eyes. He had spent his entire life building a world of secrets. He had believed that power was the only thing that could keep a person safe, that the only way to survive was to be the deadliest thing in the room. But as he listened to Uruna describe a life of mundane, beautiful insignificance, he realized he had it backward. He wasn't powerful. He was a prisoner of his own shadow. "I want you to see the ocean," Uruna continued, unaware of the man standing in the hallway. "Not the gray harbor where the ships bring the crates, but the blue ocean, where the horizon never ends. That's where we're going, somewhere where the only thing you have to fear is the sun going down too soon." The simplicity of her desire, the blue ocean, hit Jinwoo with the force of a physical blow. He thought of the men he had killed to protect his territory, the lives he had ruined to maintain the order Kang spoke of. None of it mattered. None of it could buy the peace he was hearing in that lullaby. He looked at his hands in the dim light. They were clean of blood for now, but they were scarred and calloused, instruments of a trade that had no place in the world Uruna was describing. He realized in that moment that he couldn't go back. He couldn't sit at the head of the syndicate table and order hits while knowing that somewhere a mother was trying to shield her child from the very ripples those hits created. The boss was dead. He had been killed by a baby's coo and a plate of spicy rice. He tapped softly on the door, and the humming stopped instantly. Aruna looked up, her body tensing, the mask of the fugitive snapping back into place. "It's me," Jinwoo said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it. He stepped into the room, not at the woman, but at the child. "The ocean you spoke of? There is a place in Jeju, far from the ports. It's quiet. The air smells of salt and tangerines." Aruna stared at him, her breath hitching. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you were right," Jinwoo said, meeting her eyes. "A fortress is just a cage if you're the only one with the key. I've spent 20 years locking doors, Aruna. It's time I opened one." He turned to leave, but stopped at the threshold. "Get your things ready. We don't wait for the 7th day. We leave tonight." "And Aruna?" "Yes?" "Keep singing," he said, his back to her. "It's the only thing in this house that makes sense anymore."
As he walked back to his office to prepare for the violence he knew was coming, Jinwoo didn't feel like a mafia boss. He felt like a man who had finally found something worth losing everything for. The ghost account was no longer his treasure, it was his exit fee. He picked up the drive and tucked it into his pocket, his mind no longer on the syndicate, but on the scent of tangerines and the sound of a blue horizon. The stillness of the penthouse was shattered at precisely 2 a.m., not by a sound, but by the sudden, eerie flickering of the city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The power grid for the entire block had been surged. A moment later, every screen in Jinwoo's office, his monitors, his tablet, even his encrypted burner phone, ignited with a single high-definition image, a live drone feed of his own balcony. Jinwoo stood slowly, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. He didn't need to answer the phone when it finally vibrated on the desk. He simply picked it up and pressed it to his ear. "The sun rises in 4 hours, Jinwoo." The voice on the other end was a rasping contrast to the quiet of the room. It was the chairman, the patriarch of the Seo Syndicate, a man who viewed human lives as mere decimal points on a ledger. "The Viper has made his demands. He wants the Maid and the drive. If we hand them over, the war ends. We keep the docks, the politicians, and the peace. If we don't, the Seo name is erased by breakfast." "She is a witness, Chairman," Jinwoo said, his voice a steady, frozen river. "And the drive is the only thing keeping the Viper from cutting our throats the moment he has it. Handing them over isn't peace, it's suicide." "You're thinking like a man who has something to lose," the chairman countered. "That is a weakness we didn't raise you to have. You have until dawn to bring them to the warehouse at Pier 7. If you aren't there with the girl and the child, the syndicate will consider you a traitor. And you know how we treat traitors, Jinwoo. We don't just kill them, we unmake them." The line went dead. Jinwoo turned to find Aruna standing in the doorway, Mila wrapped tightly in the tattered silk scarf. She didn't ask what the call was about. The way Jinwoo held himself, shoulders squared, jaw locked in a lethal line, told her everything. The 7 days of grace had been stolen. They were down to hours. "They want us," she whispered. It wasn't a question. "They want the ghost account," Jinwoo replied, walking toward her. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, before he pulled it back, the habit of the boss fighting the instinct of the protector. "The syndicate thinks I'm a loyal soldier. They think I'll trade your life for my seat at the table." "Will you?" Aruna asked. There was no judgment in her voice, only the flat, exhausted reality of a woman who had been traded her entire life.
Jinwoo looked at Mila,
who was fast asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in the perfect rhythm of the innocent. He thought about the chairman's threat. To be unmade meant the total erasure of his existence, his assets frozen, his name blacklisted, and a professional hit squad on his trail until the end of time. He would lose the penthouse, the millions, and the power that had been his only identity for 2 decades. "I spent 20 years becoming the man they wanted me to be," Jin-woo said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I built their empire. I bled for their chair. But they made one mistake." He stepped closer, finally letting his hand rest on Aruna's arm. His touch was firm, a silent promise. "They forgot that I'm the one who knows where all the bodies are buried, and I have the map in my pocket." He pulled the silver USB drive from his jacket. "This drive doesn't just end the war, Aruna. It ends the syndicate. If I give this to the authorities, the Seo clan, the Parks, the Viper, all of them will be dismantled by noon. But we have to get to the neutral zone first. We have to survive the next 4 hours." He moved with a sudden, sharp efficiency, grabbing a tactical vest from a hidden compartment and a heavy matte black duffel bag. He handed Aruna a bulletproof insert to slip into the baby's carrier. "The chairman thinks he gave me an ultimatum," Jin-woo said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I spent 20 years becoming the man they wanted me to be. I built their empire. I bled for their chair. But they made one mistake." He turned off the remaining lights in the penthouse, plunging them into a darkness lit only by the distant flickering neon of the city. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his eyes narrowing as he watched the elevator light in the hallway begin to glow. The syndicate wasn't waiting for dawn. They were coming for their answer now. "And keep her head down. From this moment on, Seo Jin-woo no longer exists. There is only the man who is going to get you to the ocean." The elevator hummed, the sound of a predator approaching. Jin-woo stood in the center of his unbreakable fortress, a man who had lost everything and found himself in the process, ready to turn his sanctuary into a battlefield. The silence of the penthouse was not broken by a shout, but the hollow metallic thud of a flashbang canister hitting the hardwood floor. Jin-woo didn't wait for the explosion. He grabbed Aruna by the waist and pulled her and Mila behind the kitchen's reinforced granite island, just as the world turned into a blinding white roar. He didn't cover his own ears. He used his hands to press Aruna's head down, shielding Mila's sensitive eardrums with his palms.
As the smoke began to curl through the air, the glass balcony doors shattered. 3 shadows repelled in, their silhouettes cutting through the neon haze of the Seoul skyline. They were the chairman's elite, men Jin-woo had trained himself. "Stay low. Do not move until I touch your shoulder," Jin-woo whispered, his voice as cold and steady as the steel in his hand. He didn't fire blindly. He moved like a ghost through the smoke he knew so well, navigating his own home by memory. He knew the exact angle of the shadows and the blind spots created by his minimalist furniture. The first intruder didn't even see him. Jin-woo rose from behind a designer lounge chair, the suppressed thud-thud of his sidearm dropping the man before his boots had fully settled on the floor. The other 2 opened fire, their submachine guns chewing through the expensive plaster and wood where Jin-woo had been standing a second before. Jin-woo wasn't there. He had slid across the polished floor, using a heavy marble statue as cover. He pulled a small remote from his pocket, a panic feature he'd installed years ago. He pressed it, and the high-output gallery lights above the intruders flickered into a strobe effect, disorienting their night vision goggles.
In that fractured light, Jinwoo was a predator in his element. He moved with a brutal, surgical efficiency, his movements a sharp contrast to the terrified huddle of the woman and child behind the counter. He took out the second man with a single shot to the chest, then closed the distance on the third, disarming him with a wrist-shattering blow before ending the threat with a clinical finality. "Jinwoo!" Aruna's voice was a jagged shard of glass. He spun around. The elevator doors were opening. Kang stepped out, but he wasn't alone. He held a heavy-caliber rifle, and his eyes were fixed not on Jinwoo, but on the kitchen island where Aruna was hiding. "You're throwing away a kingdom for a maid who can't even speak your name correctly," Kang shouted over the ringing in the air. "Is this how the great Seo Jinwoo dies, protecting a squatter?" "I'm not dying today, Kang," Jinwoo replied, his voice echoing from a corner Kang couldn't quite pin down. "But the syndicate is." Jinwoo threw a heavy metal decorative bowl across the room. As Kang's barrel instinctively tracked the noise, Jinwoo stepped out from behind a pillar. He didn't aim for Kang's head. He aimed for the gas line he had loosened earlier behind the professional-grade range. A single spark from his muzzle ignited a localized burst of flame that sent Kang reeling back toward the elevator. The fire acted as a temporary wall, a curtain of orange heat between the predators and the prey. Jinwoo reached the kitchen island in 3 strides. He scooped Mila up with his left arm, tucking her against his chest, and grabbed Aruna's hand with his right. "Now," he commanded. He didn't lead them toward the front door or the elevator. Instead, he headed for the service spirit lift, a small hidden elevator used for discreet deliveries. As they scrambled inside the cramped metallic box, the sounds of more boots hitting the floor echoed from the living room. The lift jerked downward. In the tiny, dimly lit space, Jinwoo was breathing hard, his tailored suit jacket torn and stained with drywall dust and blood. Mila began to cry, a thin, terrified wail that filled the small enclosure.
Aruna reached out, her hands shaking as she took the baby from him. She looked at Jinwoo, seeing the raw, lethal energy still vibrating off him. "You saved us," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and horror. "We aren't saved yet," Jinwoo said, checking his remaining magazine. He looked at the silver USB drive he had tucked into the baby's blanket for safekeeping during the fight. "We've just burnt the bridge. Now we have to see if we can swim." As the lift reached the sub-basement, Jinwoo straightened his tie by habit, though it was frayed at the edges. He looked like a man who had survived a war, because he had. He had fought his own shadow and won. But as the doors opened to the dark, exhaust-filled garage, he knew the hardest part of the escape was just beginning. The chairman's reach was long, but Jinwoo's resolve had finally found a heart. 6 months had passed since the night the sky over Seoul burned with the fire of a dying empire. The world believed Seo Jinwoo was dead, a casualty of the spectacular explosion that had leveled Pier 7, an event that had simultaneously released the ghost account to every major news outlet and prosecutor in the country. In the wake of the data leak, the syndicate had folded like a house of cards, its leaders fleeing into the shadows or behind bars. But the man who had pulled the pin on the grenade was nowhere to be found. Halfway across the world, on a coast where the air smelled of salt and ripening tangerines rather than exhaust and ozone, a man known simply as Jin sat on a weathered wooden bench. He was dressed in a simple linen shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that no longer bore the tension of a predator. The sharp-featured, stern face that had once frozen the hearts of rivals had softened under the persistent warmth of a tropical sun. His posture was no longer rigid or controlled. He sat with his elbows on his knees, breathing in the rhythm of the tide. 50 yards away, where the white sand met the reaching fingers of the turquoise sea, the blue horizon Aruna had once whispered about stretched out into infinity.
Jin watched as Aruna walked along the shoreline. She wore a bright flowered dress that caught the wind, her natural hair free and catching the light. She looked younger, the hollow terror that had defined her face in the penthouse, replaced by a radiant, grounded peace. Beside her, Mila, no longer a bundle of cloth and silence, was taking determined, wobbly steps through the shallow surf. Her small, chubby legs splashed in the water, and her delighted shrieks of laughter carried over the sound of the waves.
Jin didn't approach them. He stayed in the shade of the palms, a silent protector whose presence was felt rather than seen. He had faked their deaths and his own with the surgical precision of a man who knew exactly how the syndicate cleaned its messes. He had sacrificed the millions, the tailored suits, and the iron throne of Seoul to buy this specific moment of insignificance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone Mila had given him earlier that morning. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its weight. In his old life, he would have judged its value based on what it could buy or who it could hurt. Now it was a treasure because it was a gift from a child who called him Jin without fear. Aruna stopped and looked back toward the bench. She didn't wave, they were still careful even here, but she paused long enough for their eyes to meet. In that gaze there was a profound, unspoken understanding. She knew the cost of their freedom. She knew that the man who had been a robot of violence had dismantled himself so that she could have a home that wasn't a cage. He watched her reach down to scoop Mila into her arms as the sun began its slow, golden descent toward the water. The light turned the spray of the ocean into a mist of gold. Jin leaned back against the bench and closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't a vacuum he had to fill with orders or threats. It was a fullness. The 7 days of grace had long since expired, replaced by a lifetime he hadn't believed he deserved. He was a man with no title, no empire, and no shadow. He was jobless, nameless, and technically dead to the world he had once ruled. But as the sound of Mila's laughter echoed against the cliffs, Seo Jin-woo finally felt rich. He had traded a kingdom of blood for a blue horizon, and as he listened to the tide come in, he realized that his heart, once cold and mechanical, was finally beating in time with the world. He was no longer a boss. He was a man at peace, watching over the only 2 people who knew his true name.